I think people have to resist the temptation of thinking that office space up until 2020 has been static. Offices have been changing forever, and they will continue to morph.
Welcome to Tank Talks, a podcast that brings you insights and stories from some of the best and brightest minds in technology and investing. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On this week's episode, we welcome Rob Kumer from KingSett Capital to discuss his journey from analyst to CEO and his early career influences and pivotal moments that shaped him into the leader he is today. Rob shares why he decided to join KingSett in the early days and how working underneath one of Canada's most well-known real estate investors, John Love, played a role in his decision-making. We discuss the evolution of KingSett and the multiple investment strategies the firm employs and how the pandemic affected their business early on. Lastly, Rob offers his views on the Canadian housing crisis and provides insights on how the government can improve the productivity issues we are facing in this country. Now, let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Rob Kumer from KingSett Capital. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Rob.
Great to be here. I'm always happy to do these kinds of things. I hope whoever's listening out there enjoys it.
Our listeners are familiar with your amazing partner and executive chairman of KingSett Capital, John Love, from some of our other previous podcasts, but may not be as familiar with yourself. You've had a significant journey in commercial real estate, climbing up the ranks as analyst to now recently announced CEO of KingSett. But it'd be great if you can give our listeners a brief background on where you grew up, your early professional career path, and how you ended up being named the CEO of KingSett.
My upbringing, look, born and raised in Toronto, my whole life has basically taken place within about 10 kilometers of where I'm sitting at the corner of Bay and King. And that's both a good and a bad. There's some parts about that I really love. There's some parts about it that I would, part of me would like to do differently. The good is, all of my relationships are here. My family is here. My friends are here. My business and professional relationships are here. I went to university 2 hours down the highway, came back to Toronto immediately when I was done, started working. So my entire ecosystem is all, very close by, and that has lent itself very well to the business that I'm in. And in my view, a big component of what has helped me be, successful. On the other hand, there's a part of me that looks back on my life and says, I wish I spent a little bit of time away doing something perhaps a little bit out of the box in another part of the world, learning about and understanding the way other people approach things, other cultures approach things. I think it would be a healthy learning experience. It's something that I encourage other people to do. Certainly my kids, as they get older, it's going to be something that I encourage them to do because I think it can add a lot of value to one's personal and professional development. That all said, you have a family, kids, house, mortgage, job, career. It's tough to sort of do that later in life. So that phase of my life is probably behind me. And I'll have to just live with the regret. All that said, graduated from business school in spring of 1999, went to go work for a real estate development business here in Toronto. Spent a couple of years doing that. We were building shopping centers, basically supermarket anchored shopping centers across the province. From there, I went to a company called RioCan, Real Estate Investment Trust, which is actually, I think still today, Canada's largest real estate investment trust. Big company, great company. Learned a lot, worked with some amazing people there. Was there for 4 years, from 2000 to 2004. And in 2004, I hit the road and started looking for something a little different. Came across KingSett as part of a job search, really. I didn't know much about them. Had heard of John at the time, but certainly didn't know him or had never met him. Came to talk to him and a couple of the other senior leaders of the business. Sounded really interesting, high energy. It was a fairly new business, fairly young business, about a year and a half in to its tenure. Great opportunity. Great people, great strategy. And so I jumped at the opportunity to come join them. And I did so in summer of 2004 and have been here ever since, 20 years.
Obviously, it's obviously worked out for you, but I want to touch on that part you mentioned about how you wish you may have experienced something outside of the Toronto bubble, if you will. Obviously, my oldest brother and brothers who have advised me on traveling around the world and also working out of the, U.S. markets, living in New York, working out of Boston, things like that. And obviously, it opened up my eyes. Just for a second here, what do you think you would have learned differently, or maybe skill sets you would have been exposed to, or challenges you would have been exposed to if you did that?
Yeah, well, look, I think, first of all, the exercise of putting yourself into a situation that's new, unfamiliar with people you don't know is in and of itself a learning experience and part of, can be a big part of personal development. I never really had that. I never really pushed myself in that way. That's part of what makes, great people great. And it's something that I've just never been able to really bank on. And now, I think I've pushed myself in other ways, so it's okay, but it's all worked itself out. But I think different people in different places with different cultures make different kinds of decisions. They behave in different ways. They approach things with different attitudes and different perspectives. If one were to go to Europe, they would experience something different from what they would experience if they went to New York. I think if you're in New York, you experience something different than what you might experience if you were in Toronto. I mean, it's always interesting when you are doing business with people from other parts of the world, right? And they approach things differently. Americans tend to approach things in one way. Canadians approach things quite differently. Asians approach things in a different way from Canadians. Europeans approach things in a different way. And I find if I were to have had some exposure to things like that, I think it would make me better at adapting to some of the different kinds of perspectives that you run into sitting here in Toronto. And today, the world's much more, with the onset, obviously, of virtual technology and just sort of the evolution of the global marketplace. Today, Canada, Toronto in particular, is way more global today in a real estate investment perspective than it has been 20 years ago. I think I'd be further along, in understanding those different perspectives and understanding and adapting to those different approaches. So I've had to learn along the way. It's not fatal, but I think just looking back, if I were to give myself 20 years ago advice, I'd say go spend some time in a different place. And I would encourage people out there to do that.
I appreciate that self-reflection, that self-awareness. That's definitely advice that I've been given and will be continuing to give to people younger than me. But, you mentioned you decided to leave RioCan, obviously Canada's largest real estate firm, to join what at the time was an emerging real estate private equity firm. How did the chance to work with someone like John Love impact your decision to join KingSett? And what role did he play in your progression as a real estate investor?
Yeah, so when I left RioCan, it was less about leaving RioCan and more about finding, something else that I was looking for. I mean, I had spent 4 years at RioCan doing investments, property investments, buying and selling shopping centers. And that, for those of us who have bought and sold shopping centers in the institutional sense, we will know that buying one shopping center is sort of like buying every shopping center. I mean, the tenants are the same, the leases are the same. It can become a fairly routine the actual exercise of underwriting and doing the due diligence and setting the agreements and so on and so forth can become fairly routinized. I had done it for 4 years. I was a young person. We did a ton of transactions. I learned a ton. I worked for great people. It was a great environment, hyper growth. I mean, we went from about $1 billion in assets to $4 or $5 billion in assets in 2004. I was part of a small team. I worked for a woman who was the head of investments, who was amazing and smart and treated me well. My partners and my colleagues in the group were amazing. We had a lot of fun, and it was a great bunch of years. All that said, my observation in seeing RioCan grow, and to some extent at KingSett, but hopefully we've been able to do something a little different here, is that as organizations grow and become more institutional and more rigorous, individual roles can narrow. As an analyst at a bigger company, my day-to-day, hour-to-hour responsibilities tended to narrow and become more and more focused. And for me, it just didn't have the go-get-itness that I wanted. So I went out looking for something in real estate, but something more entrepreneurial. I wanted to get away from retail real estate. As I said, for at that point, 6 years, between two jobs, 6 years, I had done just retail investments and development. So I wanted to see other asset classes and think about different things. And I wanted to get to a business that was more entrepreneurial, a little bit of a different growth trajectory. I'd gone through some hyper growth at RioCan. I sort of wanted to do that again. And I came across KingSett. I didn't really know much about KingSett at all, and I didn't know anything about private equity. I mean, that term, although I knew the term, was not something that was familiar to me. And frankly, within the real estate context at that time, there wasn't any private equity real estate businesses in Canada. So there was really no familiarity with private equity real estate. But I met John, and I met a couple of the other founding partners and some of the other senior leadership team here. It was just, there was great chemistry, and they had a lot of very cool things going on. It wasn't a startup, but there was sort of like this mystique, like this intangible mystique about the group. I think partly because private equity real estate was just in its infancy. They were really sort of pioneering the business in Canada. John had this, to some extent, larger than life persona, again, who I didn't know personally, but certainly knew of and had a reputation that was, quite remarkable. And I thought it was something exciting, and this was something that I could be a part of really at, not quite the ground level, but pretty close to ground level. Looking back, my instincts were bang on, and I've had the good fortune of joining a great group with a great team, with great support from stakeholders, a sound strategy, an aggressive growth plan, and we spent 20 years building that business out. And today we look back, and it's quite a different business today than it was 20 years ago. But it's been a remarkable ride, and I'm grateful that I have had the opportunity to be part of it. John's particular influence in getting me to join, I was probably, it wasn't so much John. I mean, it was the whole package all put together. Again, I didn't know John, so I had met him and we got along really well, and I felt really good about it. It was only later in the process, once I started working here and spending some time here and ultimately working, very closely with John over a period of many years, that I can look back and really understand the gravity with which he has impacted my career, my life, taught me things, instilled a core set of values, and really shown me quite a remarkable, has acted as quite a remarkable role model for me to at least set, a path behind him. And taking the reins from him earlier this year as CEO is just sort of the culmination of, a 20-year process that has been, as I said, like just a remarkable ride.
Yeah, unbelievable. 20 years, you were now CEO and took over officially of January 2024. But as you mentioned, KingSett has really evolved from the early days as a pioneer of private equity real estate in Canada and has amassed a large pool of capital across many different strategies, obviously within real estate, but smaller than what it started out as, is now ballooned into this $17 billion private equity real estate firm. Can you explain maybe how the firm has been able to be so successful at raising capital in Canada, where capital pools are often limited at scale? When you've reached a certain scale, you kind of have to go out, like Brookfield has or some of the other private equity firms?
So it's really the DNA of the business. So the business started in 2000. As I said, John started it in 2002, really with just an opportunity fund strategy. So we have what we call our growth funds, which is what Canadians would call an opportunity fund strategy, which is really all about what we call C investing: sourcing, executing, exit. Okay, so we get into something, we invest capital in a particular opportunity, we execute a plan, so we do something to whatever, we execute the business plan, which is either, you lease the building or you build the building or you zone the land or you reposition the building, you do whatever the plan is, you execute that. And when you're done, you exit, you return the capital and all the profits back to the investors, and you do that over and over and over again in a closed-end fund. And then ultimately, you raise another fund. So today, it started with LP1 in 2002. Today, we're on LP8, which we raised in August of 2022, which is, and just to give you a sense of context, Fund 1 was $220 million of capital. They've grown in size over the years. LP8, which again was raised in August of 22, is at $2 billion. Of capital, which is sort of a $6 to $8 billion investment program. So they've grown, quite substantially over the years. In 2006, we started our credit business, which was, the high yield fund. So we said, where is there a need in the marketplace for capital, and how can we help solve, that need? So we started our debt business, which started as a high yield fund, has eventually grown into what we call our senior mortgage fund, from there into our CMHC lending business and so on. So that business started in 2006 out of a need for credit. In 2008, we started our core income fund. We looked again at the market. It was the early stages of the global financial crisis. There was a need by investors for yield. So we said, how can we start a new strategy that helps satiate the need for yield? So we started our core income fund, which is an open-end fund that owns and operates institutional quality income producing real estate and pays, a steady distribution each month, grows in value over time, and so on and so forth. So, that was the core fund. A few years back, we started what we call our urban infill fund. As the whole trend of urbanization started, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver, we started a business that was focused on buying urban core transit-oriented real estate in the path of intensification. So we grew that business to close to $1 billion business. Then we started a residential development business. Now we just recently started an affordable housing fund. So what our DNA has always been to look at the market, to assess the market, see where there are holes in the capital sources. What does the market need? What do investors need? Remember, every business strategy starts with, how do we solve a problem for somebody? Right? That's the thesis. So again, in 2002 with the Opportunity Fund, it was the problem that the Opportunity Fund was solving was that institutions in Canada all had their own real estate business, or the big institutions had their own real estate business. They had the core business. Like the case today, Poe would own office buildings and shopping malls. Aimco had their own core business. IMCO, which at the time was Ontario OPB, had their own business. They all had their own core real estate investment businesses. What they didn't have was opportunity real estate. They didn't have development. They didn't have going back to the C strategy, source, execute, exit. They didn't have that sort of little higher risk, little higher return, a little more operational intensive, execution intensive component. They didn't have that team built out. So they used us, KingSett, as a way to access those kinds of opportunities, taking a small slice of capital relative to their overall size, allocating it to KingSett. KingSett goes out and makes the investment, executes the plan, generates the returns, gives the capital back, and that allows the institutions to access that slice of the market. In 2006, there was a desire for investors to invest in credit. So we started the credit business. In 2008, it was yield. So we invested in, we started the yield business. So it was all in response to what our assessment was of what the market needed. And I think that really is built into the DNA of us here. And we're constantly looking for those kinds of opportunities. When we started our residential development business back in 2021, it was in response to the fact that the city needed housing. We had a pipeline of land. We didn't really have the residential team to get all this stuff built, but we had the relationships with others who had the skills. And so we looked at it as an opportunity to take our land pipeline and our capital and our access to scale capital, partner with best-in-class home providers, and develop housing. That's been very successful. We're just coming now to the end of our first fund, and we'll look to raise our second fund. Again, the affordable housing was in response to the housing affordability crisis that we have today in Toronto and really in many parts of Canada. So it's all about responding to what's needed in the market, identifying how we can best execute and how we can add value, and then getting on with it.
Yeah, I mean, that C approach, that search, execute, and exit is like skating where the puck is going. But in real estate investors are like freightliners. They don't move very quickly. They're not speedboats. They're not startups. So it sounds like you guys are really doing a great job listening to what the market wants and then implementing it very quickly. But maybe walk us through how you're actually doing those discovery conversations with the large asset allocators, the pensions, the endowments, or whatever you will, who have this capital sitting in their hands and they need to put it to work. And then they basically say, KingSett, Rob, go find us these assets that we haven't been able to find or we can't find, and execute on them and also return a profit and then do it again and again and again. What does that process look like inside?
Yeah, so I don't think it's about asking them where they want to invest and responding to it. I think it's about us identifying what the opportunities are, presenting the thesis to them, and seeing if it resonates. And raising capital for a new strategy starts with finding, a lead investor. So that's always where it starts. So what we'll typically do is we'll think of an idea here. And let me give you an example. So our urban fund, which is actually a really interesting example. Our urban, we call it UIF, or Urban Infill Fund, which started around 2014, 2015. So we privatized, it goes back to in our opportunity fund strategy, we privatized a REIT called Primaris, which actually is today still around in a different incarnation. But at the time, it was a shopping mall owner, a publicly traded shopping mall owner, that we privatized, along with H&R REIT, in partnership with H&R REIT and RioCan and our partners at IMCO. And so when we privatized that business, the REIT owned, this is a bit of a long-winded story, but I think it'll address your question. When we privatized that REIT, there's a whole portfolio of enclosed shopping malls. And then, $5 billion portfolio of shopping malls, regional shopping malls. And then they have 4 buildings sitting on Yonge Street at the corner of Yonge and Gerrard. Okay, 4 little street front buildings, downtown Toronto, at the corner of Yonge and Gerrard. These are retail buildings with an apartment on top. Okay, like buildings you'd walk by as you're walking up Yonge Street. And IMCO didn't want them. H&R didn't want them. RioCan certainly didn't want them. So we said, you know what, we'll take them. Okay. And they weren't even next to each other. They were on the southeast corner of Yonge and Gerrard. And they were sort of like a checkerboard. Like they owned one, then they didn't own one, then they had the next one, then they didn't have the one after that. And then they owned four altogether, separated by 3 or 4 different buildings. So we sort of took them as a consolation, as a compromise to our partners, saying no one else wanted them. We said, you know what, we'll take them. We'll figure out what to do with them. So we took them. And then one by one, we filled in the missing pieces, okay? So we bought the 3 other buildings, and that took months and quarters. It didn't happen in weeks. It took a fair amount of time. It took a fair amount of energy. But ultimately, we filled in all the pieces, and we assembled about an acre site. So altogether, we owned 8 or 9 buildings. It was sort of 30 or 40,000 square feet of land, directly on the corner of Yonge and Gerrard, kitty corner to the Aura condo tower, which we built in a joint venture with Canderel, which is Canada's largest or tallest tower, certainly at the time, might be outdone now, but at the time, 78 floors, like big, tall building, 1,000 condos, 1 million square feet. And we owned an acre on the other corner. So we said, geez, now that we own an acre, maybe we can zone it and get a big, tall building. So we zoned it, again, for about 1 million feet. And then we flipped it. So we didn't flip it. We sold the land to another developer. And now the building's under construction, actually, if you drive by it now. But in that exercise, what we realized was, wow, if we can pick the right street corners and buy real estate in locations that we think over time will disproportionately benefit from the ongoing intensification and gentrification of Toronto's core, we can make a lot of money. And so we started so we came up with the thesis of the Urban Infill Fund. And really the thesis was, let's buy these street corners in interesting locations. We're not quite sure exactly how we're going to make money, but based on everything that's going on around all these street corners, with all the towers going up and the transit getting built and the people moving in and so on and so forth, over time we're going to make money. So it didn't have what I'll call the identifiable value creation catalyst that our opportunity fund looks for, the source, execute, exit. Couldn't do that because we didn't have the execute. We didn't know what the execute was. And it didn't have the core long-term income characteristics that our income fund wanted. It was sort of a hybrid in the middle. Had a little bit of income, had some value creation that you couldn't really articulate at the time, but we knew it was going to end well. We started calling it rich guy real estate, right? The kind of real estate that rich guys go and buy, tuck away, never really look at again, collect some rent checks, and ultimately they give down to their kids or their grandkids, right? Monopoly. And we realized this could be a really great thesis. So we put all that together, in a more eloquent fashion than I've just done, into a presentation, and we go and we test it with our big investors, and we say, how does this does this resonate with you? And the guys will either say, I get it, I want part of it, or they'll say, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like they'll say one of those two things. To the extent you can get them to say, I get it, I want to invest, that you have your thesis, and then that all sticks. Once you have sort of the 1 or 2 lead guys, filling in the balance tends to sort of work for itself. But that's how things get done here. We get someone with an idea, you put it together, you validate it through discussions with investors, and then you get going.
Well, I mean, that obviously makes sense. And while your strategies have continued to evolve, but grow and 10x in size, but obviously a lot of things have to do with the market, right? The market starts to change, and that also dictates a lot. I'd like to go back a few years, if you don't mind, and take us through the first few months of the pandemic and what sort of inside baseball conversations you and John and the rest of the executive team were having in order to try and navigate those early challenges during the pandemic. Because you guys made some strategic moves with your capital during the pandemic, and I'd love to hear the look back on those.
The key to working through the effects of the pandemic, and we're still working those out, right? I mean, I don't think all of the effects are over and done with. I think we're seeing now, some tales of some of the things that went on. But I think in the early stages, the key for us is a few things. One, you got to cut out the noise. Okay, there's just so much peripheral noise that isn't part of effective decision making. So you really have to cut that stuff out, and you have to make certain assessments and then cut out, what you think is excess noise. And one of the base assumptions that we made in the pandemic was ultimately there will be a vaccine. So you had to believe that it was going to end. If you didn't believe it was going to end, you would have made a whole series of decisions. If you believed it was going to end, you'd make a different set of decisions. But so once you sort of make that assessment, then you say, okay, then what do I have to do? What's life going to look like on the back end of this? And our assessment was that life was going to, by and large, return to what it was before the pandemic. Okay, we were going to revert back to many of our same behaviors and tendencies that we had before the pandemic started. We never made the assessment that nobody was ever going to go to a shopping mall again. We never made the assessment that no one was ever going to stay in a hotel again. We never made the assessment that no one was ever going to work in an office again. I mean, that was just not something we believed. And I think for the most part, we've been proven correct. Now, the timing and the velocity with which we return back to what I'll call normal has probably been different than what we had otherwise thought. But directionally, I think we were correct. The next thing is you have to focus on what you can control, and you have to sort of ignore the things you can't control. So what we couldn't control was whether or not we were going to be open or, shut down or locked down or not, whether we were, had to wear masks or not, or whether, how banks were going to react. I mean, we couldn't affect or control any of these kinds of how appraisers were going to react. All we could control was making sure that our people are happy and they're content. So we have to obviously have a strategy for dealing with the people in the business. We have to have a strategy for dealing with our relationships outside of the business. So our consultants, our lenders, our lawyers, our accountants, all of our service providers, our partners, and so on. So we have to we have to make sure we're dealing with them. Our tenants. So we have to make sure our tenants are happy and making sure we're doing everything we can in our properties to make sure that what I'll call our customer base, is getting what they need to make it through and are happy and ultimately, remain customers over the long term. Those were the kinds of things that we focused on. And then what are those strategies? So the strategies are for the people, you have to make sure you're in touch and you're accessible. So we were having management committee meetings every day. We were having town halls with our employees, once a week. We were making sure teams were, staying in touch. This was all virtual at the time, but staying in touch and dealing with their teams, on an appropriate basis and with appropriate frequency and so on. Making sure people knew what their work was, what their roles were, what their work was, what they were responsible for, and making sure work was getting done. And then, going to the buildings and making sure we were investing in the buildings, investing in our customer relationships, making sure our customers had everything they needed to be happy and carry on the business to the extent they wanted to carry on in our buildings and so on. And then, you had to prepare for what was coming out the other end. You'd go to your shopping malls, making sure your tenant mixes were okay, making sure, you had your experience, the experience of the people who are using the buildings, not just your tenants, but your customers who are interacting with your buildings on a daily basis, had what they wanted and were attracted back, when the time came. So it was all about, controlling all the things and focusing on all the things that you could control.
It sounded like you had to go on the defensive, though, mostly, because you couldn't be on the offensive. There wasn't really anything going on, right?
Well, I don't know. In 2020, we privatized Northview REIT. So, I'd say that was pretty offensive. That was a $5 billion transaction. If you made the assessment that apartment buildings were a sound investment, pandemic or no pandemic, following through on the Northview privatization was actually a pretty sound decision. Now, if you had made the assessment that the world was going to blow up and no one was ever going to leave, their homes again, and and we were never going to return back to anything that resembled what we consider normal, putting that transaction together in the fall of 2020, probably would have looked a lot different. So I don't think we were on defense. There were parts of our business that were on defense, 100%, but we were very much on offense. Like look, financing was available, capital was available. You just had to make the assessment that the world was going to return to something that resembled 2019 instead of 2020. If you were able to do that, there were opportunities out there, and Northview was a transformational deal for KingSett. It transformed our core income fund from a commercially based fund into, a third, maybe more than a third of its assets were residential. Huge transformation and a huge piece of value creation over the following 4 years. So there was a lot of offense going on at that time. And it wrapped up LP7. We raised LP8 in 2022, which is in the middle of the pandemic, which set the investment strategy in the growth fund strategy for the next 4 years. It was a pretty, we were on a lot of offense.
Well, the interest rate situation at the time, obviously, where the government was trying to simulate and whatever they could, while obviously battling a pandemic, I guess in the short term helped soften the blow to any real estate vacancies. And in the multi-res space and the apartment space, those obviously proved out to be great bets. I think what now we're struggling with is obviously the commercial real estate and how valuations and the equity cushions are starting to change as interest rates have obviously risen to levels we had not anticipated and have stayed there. So the operating fundamentals of some of these assets are changing. I guess, right now we're sitting in a bit of a balance in certain areas, but I don't know exactly where some of the non-AAA offices are. We've seen obviously rising vacancies in downtown Toronto. You guys have been very vocal about getting people back in office and getting those urban cores back to capacity. What we're seeing in the US is very different, I think, than what we probably will see in areas like Toronto. But what are your senses of around where everything will start to shake out for everything below AAA in the major cities in Canada?
Look, it's getting a lot of airtime. I mean, for sure, it's getting a lot of airtime, this topic, probably more airtime than it deserves. But people can't, it's sort of like a traffic accident. People can't look away for whatever reason. There's without a doubt a bifurcation underway in the market. So what I mean by that is the good buildings are operating well. The less good buildings are operating less well. And you're starting to see, as you do in any or in most down cycles, you see tenants high grading their space. So they're moving up the quality curve. And that in and of itself is not unusual. The whole work from home narrative, in my view, is sort of over. I think what we've seen is that businesses are by and large back at the office in one form or another. Now, they might be back 3 days a week, not 5 days a week or 4 days a week or what have you, but they are using generally the same space they were before. We have a couple of things going on in Toronto, which I think is a good example, but there's a few things going on in Toronto that are having an impact on the market, but it's not work from home. I think there's one, we are in a low growth agenda. I mean, our political leadership, for better or for worse, has decided that they are going to stifle business growth and do everything they can to drive capital investment away from Canada. And therefore, we are left with basically a shrinking economy, particularly on a per capita basis, a shrinking economy. That's driving, softness in the office market. And I think that won't vastly change until we get back to a pro-growth agenda. I mean, we need the economic engine to turn itself back on, and we need the political leadership in place in order to get that done. So that starts with that. Also, the second thing, which has been going on for a number of years now, is the retreat in tech. Toronto had been dominated by the technology industry for 10 years, maybe more, maybe 12 or 15 years. And it was the largest sector of growth for downtown Toronto office. Tech has been in a retreat now for quite some time, certainly Canadian tech. And that combined with some of the policies that have been laid out by the federal government has driven whatever technology investment there is into other places. And Toronto has really suffered because of that. And that's taken an entire swath of users and move them away. Certainly has cut off the tap in terms of demand. So when you add that to a few new buildings come on stream, and obviously the tails of work from home, you're left with what I would say is a relatively soft market. Certainly soft compared to what it was going into the pandemic and through much of the pandemic. But what you're seeing is that the good buildings are withstanding the shock, and the not so good buildings are having a much tougher time. And I think that's going to continue for a while. But ultimately, I think there's a couple of things that we have to stay focused on. One is that the operating fundamentals in the AAA buildings is pretty solid. And take Scotia Plaza by way of example. And I know there's lots of media reports out there talking about availability and vacancy and so on and so forth. Today we have about 90,000 square feet of space that we can talk to you about. If you were a tenant and you wanted to come lease some space in Scotia Plaza, you'd have your choice of about 90,000 square feet. Okay, this is a 2.5 million square foot complex. So 90,000 square feet, while in an absolute sense might sound like a lot, it's about 5 floors. It's about 4.5 floors of office space.
Does that include people who would sublease though, that want out but that are currently stuck?
Yeah, there's not a lot of that in this building. I mean, there's just not a lot of space.
Just very long-term.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I'm not aware of any big pieces of sublet space in Scotia Plaza. I could be wrong on that, but I'm not aware of that at the moment. But we have about 90,000 square feet that we can come talk to you about. That's 4.5% of the building. Now, others would lead you to believe that we have an availability rate of 18% or 20% or whatever it is. Availability is a really tricky number, and it's a sort of a misleading number, and not a lot of people really understand what availability is. Availability is they take all the space that's actually vacant today, that actually is sitting vacant today. And today,
like the well.
No, that's not vacant. When I say vacant, I mean not leased and not occupied. Okay.
So the space that Shopify was going to take is not considered vacant.
That's not vacant. I don't call that vacant. Okay. What I call vacant is space that does not have a tenant obligated to pay rent on it. Okay. So it's actual vacant space. So availability is taking all that vacant space and adding to it all the space that is occupied or leased, not occupied, but that is leased to tenants that have told their landlord they want out. Okay. Or that they don't plan on renewing. Okay, so that would be Shopify. So Shopify has said to Allied, we know we have a lease here and we'll pay rent here until the end of our lease, which I think is 10 years or 12 years from now. But at the end, we're not going to renew it. We're not occupying it now and we're not going to renew it. So it adds all that space together, but does not account for all of the incoming tenants that are in negotiations for that space. So for example, in Scotia Plaza, we have 300,000 feet of standing vacancy, of which we've leased 290,000 feet of it. So of the 320 that's vacant, there's only 30,000 that's available. Now, availability statistics won't add in the 290. Okay, they'll look at all the vacancy. Then we have a law firm that has said in 2020, the end of 2025, we're going to give you back our space. They're moving across the street to Bay Adelaide. So in 2025, we're going to give you back our 120,000 feet. Well, that 120,000 feet goes into the availability statistic as being available. But the fact that we're talking to tenants and in discussions about leasing it in 2025 doesn't get netted off from availability. So these statistics are by definition, it's an inflated number. It's a number that will always be inflated because they don't take out what you're otherwise leasing. Now, between now and the end of 2025, we've got a whole team of people here who are responsible for leasing the space. So we'll have to get out and lease the space. But that space has been available for 3 years. But we can't lease it because there's a tenant there.
No, I appreciate that. That's incredibly, thoughtful way of explaining it. I think a lot of it does get lost in the headlines and in the media. But I got to ask you, we're a tech podcast. We work in, obviously an industry that is focused on productivity and efficiency and speed. How do you envision the future of office spaces in the next 5 to 10 years? Because from what we're seeing in the startup side, companies are scaling with less employees and less need to always be together all the time. What are your thoughts on that?
I think people have to resist the temptation of thinking that office space up until 2020 has been static. The office of 2020 does not look anything like the office of 2000 or of 1990. Offices have been changing, evolving, growing, shrinking, intensifying, detensifying. They've been morphing forever, and they will continue to morph forever. The ways in which people use office space today is vastly different from what it was, not so long ago, in the sense that there's more amenity space, there's more meeting space, there's more conference space. There's probably in many places fewer offices. The workstations are bigger. We don't use it 5 days a week. We use it 4 days a week. I mean, there was a time not that long ago, in fact, even in the early stages of my career, where offices were used 7 days a week. Okay? We came to the office on the weekends. That is not that long ago. I mean, in the last 25 years, that's changed. Now, today, 5 years ago, everyone was using the office 5 days a week. Today, we're using the office 4 days a week, maybe 3 days a week. And maybe not everyone at the same time. Maybe but ultimately, the office and the way in which tenants use it and design it is always changing. I mean, look, 5 years ago, if you had walked through a government office, they were packed in like sardines because the government had a regulation that they wanted to get down to, I think, 90 or 100 square feet per employee. Today, that's 150 square feet per employee. So they have half the number of employees in the same space. Now, they might not be using the space 5 days a week, but, so things are always changing. And I don't think, what I think young people forget or refuse to accept is that for some reason they think that since the beginning of time until 2020, offices always look the same. And now in 2020 to 2024, they've completely changed. When in fact, that's not the case. The fact is that offices have been changing all the time. They're constantly evolving. The same way shopping malls are evolving, industrial buildings are evolving, apartment buildings are evolving. I mean, you go into an apartment building that was built in the last couple of years, and it's unrecognizable to the guy who was building apartment buildings in the 90s. You go into an industrial building today, and it's unrecognizable to the person who was developing an industrial building in the early 2000s.
Well, it's mostly for Amazon and third-party storage boxes now, versus what is.
We used to build buildings that are 18-foot clear, 16-foot clear, and designed for people to, do manufacturing or assembly or clothing assembly or we used to build buildings, industrial buildings, for uses that underway anymore. We don't manufacture things in Toronto anymore. So what are we? And then there was a time, 2005, 2006. You could have walked around Scarborough and bought any industrial building you wanted for $30, $40, $50 a square foot. Okay. Why? Because they were 16-foot clear, they had tight shipping, and everyone assumed they weren't good for anything. Well, today go around, and they were empty. Today go around Scarborough and you'll pay $300 a square foot for the same building. And there's tenants in there doing stuff that one never would have imagined possible 15, 20 years ago. Everything changes over time. Everything evolves. No one ever would have imagined that an apartment building would be built with a swimming pool on top 20 years ago. Today, when you build an apartment building, you got to have a swimming pool. You got to have a selling feature. So we put the swimming pools on top of the buildings.
If the days of the week have gone down from 7 days in the office to 5 days in the office to now 4 or 3, and the use cases are not going to be used for the same things that they were once used for, is your thesis that no matter if the utilization of the office is relevant, people are still going to utilize it, but just not as much and not for the same things, the demand will still come back and even be high enough that the prices we've been able to get as landlords for those offices will continue to stay the same, if not go higher? Because if demand falls off and the utilization falls off to 3 days a week, how do you keep the prices the same? Yeah,
so I think what's going to happen is that certain buildings will become obsolete, and certain buildings will benefit from that. And so if we look at today, the defining characteristics of the buildings that are not just surviving but actually thriving are buildings with good amenity package. So you got to have a good amenity. You have to have a high percentage of amenitization. You have to have access to public transit because traffic has become quite an impediment to people coming into the downtown core. So you got to have that, and you have to have a path to sustainability. Global businesses, global organizations want to be in a building with a path to zero carbon. I think if you can accomplish those three things, you'll have a building that thrives. And proof is, in the downtown market, those are the buildings that we see, really performing well. Ultimately, whether or not a business is using its office space 3 days a week or 5 days a week or 7 days a week, it has to design it and it has to design a space for peak occupancy. A peak occupancy is having everybody back all together. And I think that's something that has come full circle. 2020, 2021, people were doubting that. 2023, 2024, it's becoming more and more obvious that that's the path forward.
You mentioned it, and you're seeing obviously, outcomes from it, but you guys at KingSett have made a lot of strides towards zero carbon buildings, decarbonization of it. One, I'd like to hear about sort of the challenges you faced with this initiative early on, even to get your investors on side and to believing and foreseeing why the commercial real estate market needed this, and what technological advancements are helping you guys alter the assets that you are obviously investing in and help transform the technologies implemented into KingSett's portfolio.
The challenge, I think the very early challenge, and it didn't last very long, was making investors understand that sustainability was not a cost center. It was actually a value creation opportunity. So everyone else not everyone else, but many others in our industry look at the path to sustainability as a cost center and as something that they reluctantly take on because they think it's a part of a social mission. We don't look at it like that. We don't invest in zero carbon because we think we want to save the world. We're investing in zero carbon because we think we can make money doing it. The key to unlocking that value is cracking the code on how to spend the money or invest the money and then make money from your customers on the other end. So if you look at, for example, Scotia Plaza, we now are zero carbon here, and it was largely through the electrification of Scotia Plaza, so converting the systems, the mechanical and electrical systems, basically to electricity, to hydro, and take them off gas. And so that was largely electrification. We did it at the Royal York through deep lake water cooling, which is very cool. And we're doing that in other office buildings as well. We're just starting that underway at our building at Bay and Dundas at Atrium. So that's going ahead. We did that at the Royal York Hotel. There's other ways of doing it. For example, our building, our development, our affordable housing development in Etobicoke at Valhalla will be zero carbon through geothermal. So there you're using the Earth's heat underground to heat and cool the water that runs through the veins of the buildings to sort of heat it and cool it and provide you with hot water. So that's a zero carbon system. All these systems that we're doing and renovating and upgrading have a cost to them. But our view is that, and you have to sort of believe sometimes, but our view is that we can generate additional revenue, incremental revenue from having these systems in place. And we have seen evidence of it, certainly at Scotia Plaza, where we now have tenants in the building who are here leasing space from us specifically because this building is zero carbon. There are only 2 office buildings in downtown Toronto, 2 buildings in the urban core of Toronto that are zero carbon. 40 King Street West and 100 Yonge Street. Those are 2 of the 3 components in Scotia Plaza. We own both of them. If you are a tenant, if you are a global brand, and you have made part of your mission, part of your brand proposal, part of your value proposal to your customer is you are going to be zero carbon, then you need to locate your office in a building that is zero carbon, or you have to buy offsets, one of the two. Okay, and my view on offsets is that it's a bit of a sham. But if you accept the fact that it's not a sham, you only have 2 options. You either have to be in an office building that's zero carbon, or you buy offsets. So if you need to locate in an office building in Toronto that's zero carbon, you have to be our customer. You don't have a choice. I'd turn to you and I'd say, is that a challenge or is that a value creation opportunity? If you're the only one that can offer it, you'll know. If you're the only person that can offer something, you've got pretty good pricing leverage. And we've seen that. And that's part of why this building is performing so well. We view the same opportunity with the Royal York, where we have conferences and group business and so on from customers who want to be zero carbon. If you are a climate conference and you want to have a climate conference in Toronto, there's only one hotel you can go to in Canada. There's only one hotel you can throw your conference at and be zero carbon, and that's the Royal York. So this kind of unique feature is a huge value creation opportunity for KingSett, and it's an enormous distinguishing feature of all the things that we're doing. And it's not something you can turn on overnight. Going zero carbon is something that we've been preparing for over a decade. We have a team. We invest the capital. We have the lending that we need. So we're putting together the capital package we need. We have the team who's got the technical expertise, and we're rolling it out piece by piece. And I think for us, it's a massive competitive differentiator. Yeah,
just to be clear, so you said KingSett never buys carbon offsets. You think it's a sham, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, I totally agree with that. And you're asking me, we invested in a company that is working on decarbonization of buildings called Thule. So we totally believe in this market and do believe it's a value creation mechanism, not a sort of nice to have goodwill kind of thing. So totally on side with you there. While I have you, Rob, I got to ask you for your views on the new proposed capital gains decisions from a Canadian government, and how do you foresee its impact on raising capital in Canada, especially for firms like you in commercial real estate?
It's another disappointing initiative from our political leadership, who is solely focused on how they can take the existing economic pie of Canada and chop it up. Instead of growing the pie, they take the same pie and they chop it up into skinnier pieces, and they give everybody a smaller piece of the same size pie. And so it's a redistribution of wealth. I think it's terrible. I think it will drive capital away from Canada one way or another. It makes us less competitive. It makes us less entrepreneurial. It will have lasting, if it doesn't get reversed with the next government. And let me tell you, as much as one likes to criticize the existing leadership, it's not clear that if we have a change in leadership, that it will be reversed. So I'm not hanging my hat that it will be reversed, in 2025 if we see a change in leadership. I don't think that that's obvious to me yet. But, I just think it's unfortunate. And I think it makes us less competitive, less entrepreneurial, and less attractive to other investors. And I think, ultimately that's just really, really sad state of affairs. I don't think it affects real estate more than it affects anybody else. I just think, it just drives capital away from Canada. Our business survives on capital. I hope it gets reversed. And beyond that, I don't think it has any narrow impact on real estate in particular.
Well, I think, your point about taking the pie and then dividing it in smaller slices is actually also the best case scenario, because that pie is actually not growing. It's declining. So you're taking a smaller pie every year that's being funded by higher interest rates that cost us more money ourselves to borrow that money to go buy our inflated goods out of a lower productivity pie. So it's actually worse off if you do it that way.
Yeah, I don't know if our economy is shrinking in an absolute sense. I mean, from what I see, is the economy is modestly growing. It's not growing as quickly as the population is growing,
or the rest of the world. So the productivity percentage,
or the rest of the world,
per capita.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, look, I mean, it's a definite struggle for anyone who wants to actually create value and deliver on, promises that they made, our investors, that obviously our government doesn't believe in holding up their end of the bargain to when they make promises themselves. But we shall see. And everyone should get out and speak their mind, just like you and John and the rest of the team at KingSett have. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure we get in our fast favorites, Rob. So first off, your favorite podcast.
My favorite podcast is the Making Sense podcast with Sam Harris. Love it. You should, if you don't listen to it already, you should.
I do.
Subscribe.
It's long, and I've met him in person. He sounds exactly like he does in the podcast in person. Yep.
No, I'm jealous that you've had a chance to meet him. I would love a chance to meet that guy. He's brilliant, articulate, has a great voice for podcasts, so he's amazing to listen to in the car. It's $100 a year to subscribe, and if you haven't listened to it, to your audience, if you haven't listened to it, sign up. Sam Harris, Making Sense podcast. He's extraordinary.
Nice. Next is your favorite newsletter or blog?
Newsletter every day, Deal Book. Andrew Ross Sorkin, who I love, New York Times, CNBC. He's great, smart, and it gives me in 3 minutes business update each and every morning around 7:30, 8 o'clock. I get it.
Have you been to the conference before?
No, I have not.
Oh, that's one I actually thought I'd check out once in New York.
Yeah.
Next is your favorite tech gadget.
My favorite tech gadget. Okay, so I'll give you two. One sort of technology based, one's not. One is the technology based one is my auto drive in my car. Allows me to do emails and text messages on my way home. For those of you who share the road with me, you might get nervous, but trust me, I do keep half an eye on the road as well and half a foot on the brake. But my car drives me home now, and I absolutely love it. And it gives me a nice productive time in the car. My non-tech gadget is in summer months, May to November, I now bike to and from work. So I bought a bicycle last spring because I was so fed up with traffic here in Toronto. I bought a bike and I started riding to and from work, and I love it. I get to work in 17 minutes in the morning. And on my way home, I take a circuitous route so that I get the big hill on the Bayview Extension, and it gives me a 45-minute workout.
Wow, good for you. I assume you've got a good change of clothes and a good...
I got myself all set up.
Okay, good. Next is your favorite new trend besides biking to work.
You know what? What is old is new again, and I'd say neckties and working from the office.
I definitely think that neckties are coming back. I like that you and John always wear them every day, 5 days a week in the office.
Back with a vengeance. Back with a vengeance.
And last but not least, your favorite life lesson.
Building relationships, man. I learned that from John, first and foremost, and that's what life is all about. If you want to be successful and you want to either build a career, build a business, build a family, you can't do it alone. You need the help of others. Be open, do the right thing, treat people properly, be transparent, say what you're going to do, and then do what you're going to say, and build relationships with others. And if you cannot be successful in life all by yourself.
Amen. Fantastic. Thanks for jumping in the tank today with Rob Kumer, CEO of KingSett Capital.
Thanks, man. Good to be here.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.